The thing about windows at night. During the day, windows never feel threatening. They're just part of a room, something you open for air, something you look through while drinking coffee or waiting for the weather to change. But at night, especially when the lights are on inside, a window becomes different. It stops being a way to see out and starts feeling like a way for something else to see in. You mostly see your own reflection, your lamp, your face, the shape of your room behind you. And past that thin piece of glass, everything outside turns dark enough to hide in. The 3 stories I'm about to tell all start with someone noticing a shadow where it should not have been. Not a monster, not anything impossible, just a shape outside a window that moved in a way it should not have. At first, each person explained it away. A tree branch, a coat hanging somewhere, reflection, tired eyes after a long night. That is usually how these things begin. You tell yourself there is a normal reason because believing the other option feels ridiculous. But later, each of them realized the first sighting had not been random. Someone was already close. They were learning how much closer they could get without being noticed by anyone inside the house yet. Story 1, the backyard window. The shadow near the kitchen light? This happened when I was staying at my mother's house one winter. It was a completely ordinary night, the kind that disappears from memory unless something happens to change it. A little after midnight, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing a mug before going to bed. The only light on was above the stove, and most of the backyard was hidden in darkness beyond the window. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a dark shape near the old lemon tree. At first, I assumed the branches were moving. That would have made sense, except there wasn't any wind. The leaves were still. Everything outside was still. Then the shape shifted. It wasn't sudden. It moved slowly, almost like someone leaning away from the glass after realizing they had been seen. I immediately turned off the faucet and froze. For several seconds, I just stared at the window, mostly seeing my own reflection looking back at me. Part of me wondered if I had imagined it. I never told my mother about it the next morning. Honestly, I was afraid of sounding dramatic over something I wasn't even sure I'd seen. Normal life, mother's house, night shifts, and routine. I was 23 at the time, and living back with my mother after leaving school earlier than I had planned. What was supposed to be a short break had quietly turned into months of sending applications, checking emails, and trying to figure out what came next. My mother never made me feel bad about it. She just told me to get back on my feet and help around the house when I could. She worked late shifts at a care home, which meant most evenings followed the same routine. She would leave before sunset, and I would have the house to myself until well after midnight. The house was small and familiar because I had grown up there, but it was showing its age. It was a single-story place with an uneven hallway floor, old window frames, and a narrow backyard that seemed much larger when I was a kid. A motion sensor light hung near the back door, though it only worked when it felt like it. The side gate never fully latched, no matter how many times someone fixed it. The kitchen window looked out onto a dark strip of yard between the fence and the house. During the day, it seemed ordinary. At night, it felt farther away than it really was. Most nights were uneventful. I reheated leftovers, folded laundry in front of the television, and sent my mother a quick text when she got home safely. Sometimes the neighbor's dog would bark for a few minutes and then stop. My mother was practical and permanently tired. If a floorboard creaked or something rattled outside, she usually blamed the house. Looking back, that normal routine was exactly why the first strange thing felt so easy to ignore. Nothing about those nights seemed capable of hiding danger. Early warning signs, small things that seemed explainable. After that night in the kitchen, I tried not to think about the shadow too much. For a few days, I convinced myself I had simply misinterpreted what I saw. But small things started happening around the house that were difficult to completely ignore. The side gate would sometimes be slightly open when I knew I had closed it earlier. Not wide open, just enough to notice. Because the latch was old and unreliable, I blamed that first. Then I started finding muddy marks near the trash bins in the backyard. They never looked obvious enough to be footprints, just patches of dirt where I didn't remember seeing them before. The motion sensor light became another thing I noticed. Every now and then, usually late at night, I would see it flick on through the living room window. By the time I checked outside, it would already be off again. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray cat passing through. Even the neighbor's dog seemed different. Instead of barking toward the street like it usually did, it would stand near the fence and bark into our yard. None of it felt serious by itself. Then one morning I walked into the kitchen and saw one of our plastic patio chairs sitting closer to the window than usual. My mother glanced at it and casually asked if I had moved it while cleaning. I immediately said no, then stopped. The truth was, I wasn't completely sure. Looking back, that chair bothers me more than anything else. It was the first sign that someone may have been standing there long enough to get comfortable. Escalation, the shadow starts appearing more often over the next couple of weeks. The shadow started appearing often enough that I could no longer dismiss it as a one-time mistake. The strange thing was that it never stayed long enough for me to get a clear look. It was always there for only a second or two, just enough to make me question myself afterward. Most of the sightings happened during ordinary moments. I would be making tea late at night and glance toward the kitchen window. For an instant I would think I saw something dark near the fence line. Then it would be gone. Other times I would walk into the laundry room to move clothes into the dryer and catch what looked like movement outside. The small window above the machine. By the time I stepped closer, there would be nothing there. Sometimes the shape seemed to stay just beyond the reach of the porch light. The motion sensor would click on, casting a weak yellow glow across part of the yard, but whatever I thought I saw always remained in the darker areas beyond it. Other times, I would notice movement in my peripheral vision, only for it to disappear the moment I turned my head directly toward it. I started changing my habits without really admitting why. The curtains were closed much earlier than before. I stopped wandering into the kitchen after midnight unless I absolutely needed something. The hallway lights stayed on almost every night. Having that extra light made me feel slightly less exposed, even though I could not have explained exactly what I was afraid of. My mother eventually noticed. One evening, she asked if everything was okay. She mentioned that I seemed tense lately and that I kept checking the windows whenever a noise came from outside. I laughed it off and blamed stress. She accepted the explanation, though I could tell she wasn't completely convinced. The moment that really unsettled me happened a few nights later. My mother was working late, and I was talking to her on the phone while cleaning up the kitchen. In the middle of our conversation, I heard a faint scraping sound from outside the window. There was a dark shape directly beyond the glass. For a second, it remained still. Then, very slowly, it lowered itself downward, as if someone had been standing upright outside the window and was deliberately crouching out of sight. By the time I reached the glass, there was nothing there. Major incident: the hand on the glass the night everything changed was during a heavy rainstorm. My mother was working late again, and I was alone in the house listening to rain strike the roof and windows. It was one of those nights where every sound outside blended together into a steady background noise. Sometime after midnight, I heard the motion sensor light click on. A few seconds later, it clicked off. Then it clicked on again. Something about that bothered me enough to get up and look. I walked into the kitchen and stared through the window. At first, I saw nothing except darkness and my own reflection. For a split second, the entire backyard lit up. There was someone standing directly outside the window. It's not near the fence, not by the gate. Right against the glass, the figure was close enough that I could clearly see one hand pressed flat against the wet window. I remember staring at it because my brain refused to process what I was looking at. The part that terrified me wasn't sudden movement or aggression. It was how still the person was. They weren't trying to get in, they weren't knocking, weren't running away after being spotted, were simply standing there as though they had been watching the house for a long time. When the darkness returned after the lightning flash, I finally screamed and backed away from the window. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped my phone while calling emergency services. By the time I looked again, the figure was moving away. Not running, walking slowly. When officers arrived, the backyard was empty. They found wet shoe prints near the wall beside the house and fresh scratches around the side gate latch. Whoever had been there was gone. But for the first time, I knew for certain that the shadow had always been a person. Aftermath: the neighbor's camera footage the next day. Our neighbor checked a security camera that covered part of the street and side yards. The footage was blurry, especially at night, but it showed someone entering our backyard multiple times over roughly 2 weeks. What stood out was that they never approached the front door. Every single time, they went directly toward the back of the house and disappeared near the kitchen window. My mother and I stayed with a relative for several nights afterward. The police never identified the person. What still bothers me most is this: They weren't lost, drunk, or confused. Whoever they were, they had learned our routine. Not every window faces a yard. After hearing that story, it is easy to assume the danger came from how isolated the house was. A backyard feels exposed. A dark fence line feels vulnerable. But many people believe apartments are safer. Third-floor window, locked entrances, and neighbors on every side create a sense of protection. The next story comes from someone who believed exactly that. They learned that being above ground means very little when someone finds another way to reach your window. Story 2. The third-floor apartment, a shadow where no one could stand at the time this happened. I lived alone on the third floor of an old apartment building. A bedroom window faced the side of the building, and there was no balcony, no fire escape, and no ledge wide enough for anyone to stand on. That detail is important because it was the only reason I initially ignored what I saw. I was working remotely one night, sitting at my desk with the curtain closed behind me, when a shadow moved across the fabric from outside. I barely reacted. My first thought was that a bird had flown past the window, or that headlights from the street had shifted somehow. Then a few seconds later it happened again. This time the shadow moved slowly in the opposite direction. I remember staring at the curtain, trying to understand what could have caused it. Because whatever passed by looked exactly like the outline of a person moving outside a window where no person should have been able to stand. Normal life, remote work, loneliness, and the apartment building. At the time, my life followed a routine that rarely changed. I worked overnight shifts doing content moderation for a company that operated around the clock. While most people in the building were sleeping, I was sitting at my desk reviewing reports, answering messages, and trying to stay awake until sunrise. Because of that schedule, my apartment often felt disconnected from the rest of the world. The place itself was small but comfortable enough. My desk sat directly beside the bedroom window. Cheap curtains hung over it, mostly to block sunlight during the day when I needed to sleep. A small fan hummed constantly beside my monitor. Half-empty coffee cups usually occupied more space on the desk than they should have. My phone charger stretched halfway across the room because the nearest outlet was in an inconvenient spot. More than once I left takeout containers sitting on the kitchen counter until the next afternoon because I was too tired to deal with them after work. The building was old, though not the kind of place people would describe as dangerous. It had the usual signs of age: pipes that knocked inside the walls, elevators that groaned when they moved, and hallway lights that flickered occasionally. There was a maintenance stairwell near the end of the corridor and rooftop access that was supposed to stay locked. Some sections of the building also had narrow service ledges outside the windows, though they were so small that most tenants never gave them a second thought. One knew a few neighbors in passing. An elderly woman lived downstairs and always watered plants outside her door. Across the hall was a couple who argued loudly enough for everyone to hear. There was also a maintenance worker who seemed quiet and harmless, the kind of person you nodded to without ever having a real conversation. Most nights, however, it was just me, the glow of my monitor, distant city noise, and hours of silence. Looking back, that loneliness made it easier to notice when something felt out of place. Early warning signs, sounds above the ceiling, a few days after the first shadow crossed the curtain. Other small things started happening around the apartment. None of them seemed important on their own, but together, they created a feeling I could never completely shake. The first thing I noticed was noise above my ceiling. It's late at night, usually between 1 and 3 in the morning. I would hear what sounded like footsteps or something being dragged slowly across a surface. The strange part was that there shouldn't have been an apartment directly above that section of my room. Above me was supposed to be rooftop access and maintenance space. Then there were smaller details. Every now and then, dust would fall near the window frame and land on my desk. During work calls, I occasionally heard a faint tapping sound from somewhere outside. One morning I opened the curtain and found a small screw or piece of metal debris sitting on the outer windowsill. I remember staring at it for a moment before throwing it away. Eventually I mentioned the noises to the landlord. He shrugged and told me old buildings made strange sounds all the time. Still, he said he would check the roof access door and make sure everything was secure. Around that same period, I saw someone in a dark hoodie standing in the maintenance stairwell late one night. I only caught a glimpse of them from behind before they disappeared up the stairs. It wasn't enough to alarm me. People came and went all the time. Even so, something felt different after that. Because my desk faced the window, the light from my monitor illuminated my face while the room behind me stayed dark. During long shifts, I started feeling as though someone could be standing outside watching me work. I never saw anyone there, but the feeling kept returning. Escalation: the curtain moves without wind. Over the following week, the shadow kept returning. Not every night, and never in a way that allowed me to fully understand what I was seeing. That uncertainty became part of the problem. Every time it happened, I found a different explanation. Maybe it was a reflection from another building. Maybe headlights were bouncing off glass somewhere. Maybe someone was doing maintenance on the roof. Once I even convinced myself it could have been a drone passing close to the building. The explanations always sounded reasonable for a few hours, then something else would happen. One night I was halfway through a shift when I noticed the curtain move slightly inward. It wasn't dramatic. The fabric simply pushed toward the room for a second before settling back into place. The window was closed. The fan was facing the opposite direction. There was no obvious reason for it to move. I got up immediately and checked the lock. Everything appeared normal. The next night, while reviewing reports at my desk, I heard a faint tapping sound against the outer glass. Tap. A few seconds later, another. The sound reminded me of a fingernail lightly touching a window, though at times it seemed more metallic, like the edge of a key or tool. Each time I looked outside, I found nothing. The incident that truly changed how I viewed the situation happened during a video call with a coworker. We were discussing a case when she suddenly stopped speaking. Her expression changed. Then she asked, "Who's behind you?" I turned around so quickly that my chair nearly tipped over. There was nobody there, only the closed curtain covering the window. When I told her that, she hesitated and said she thought she had seen movement near the edge of it. But the rest of that shift, I couldn't focus properly, because for the first time, someone else had noticed something. After that, I started using my phone to record parts of my room while I worked. I never captured anything useful. Most recordings showed an empty curtain and the glow of my monitor. One clip did contain something unusual. Near the end of the recording, a faint scraping sound could be heard outside the window. Then my own voice, barely above a whisper, asking nobody in particular if someone was there. That became the pattern. Work, coffee, blue computer light, silence. Then somewhere beyond the curtain, a soft scrape against the glass. Peak event, the face above the curtain rod the night everything came to a head, was around 3 in the morning. I was wearing headphones and listening to a coworker speak during a call when I heard a dull thud from somewhere outside the building. It was loud enough to cut through the audio in my headset. A second later, something moved near the window. At first, I thought the curtain had shifted again. Then I realized the movement wasn't near the bottom where air might affect it. It was near the very top, close to the curtain rod. I froze. The fabric twitched slightly, creating a narrow gap between the curtain and the wall. Slowly, I stood up from my desk. I remember taking only a few steps before looking directly into that gap. For a moment, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Then my brain made sense of it. There was part of a face looking in, not straight on, angled strangely from above. It looked almost upside down, as though someone was hanging over the edge of the roof or crouching somewhere above the window frame and trying to see into my room. I only saw a portion of it, an eye, part of a forehead, pale section of skin. That was enough. I backed away immediately without taking my eyes off the window. Then I left the room, shut the door behind me, and called building security and the police. By the time responders arrived, I was waiting in the hallway. They searched the roof and the maintenance areas above my apartment. The person was gone. What they did find was unsettling enough. The roof access door, which was supposed to remain locked, had been left unsecured. Near the edge above my window were fresh scuff marks. Short length of rope or maintenance strap had also been tied around a pipe nearby. Nobody could explain exactly who had been there, but someone had clearly found a way to reach a place where nobody should have been able to stand. Aftermath: the tenant who had been using the roof later, the landlord admitted that someone had apparently been accessing the roof without permission. He mentioned the possibility of a former tenant or someone connected to maintenance, but nobody ever gave a clear answer. There was no satisfying conclusion. I moved my desk away from the window almost immediately. A few months later, I moved out entirely. While packing, I made one final discovery. Looking closely at the outside edge of the window frame, I noticed several small marks in the paint and metal. They looked worn, almost polished in spots, as if fingers or tools had repeatedly gripped the same areas. That was when I realized the shadow hadn't simply passed by. Someone had been coming back. The worst shadows are the familiar ones. The first two stories are unsettling because the people outside the windows were strangers. Unknown faces are easy to fear. The final story is different. It takes place in a family home during a time when comfort and support should have mattered most. At first, the shadow outside the window seems no different from the others. What makes this one harder to forget is what the narrator eventually begins to suspect. Sometimes the most frightening possibility is not that you know nothing about the person outside. It's that you might know exactly who they are. Story 3. The childhood bedroom window, back in my old room. I hadn't slept in my childhood bedroom for years when I moved back home temporarily to help my family. My father had become seriously ill, and my mother needed help caring for him. What I expected to be a short visit quickly turned into weeks. The room felt smaller than I remembered. The furniture was mostly the same, but everything carried the strange feeling of stepping back into an earlier version of my life. One of my first nights there, I woke up sometime after midnight and noticed movement near the window. My bedroom was on the first floor, facing a narrow walkway that ran between our house and the neighbor's fence. At first I assumed I was looking at my own reflection, or maybe a tree branch shifting somewhere outside. Then the shadow stopped. It settled directly in the middle of the curtain. I remember staring at it from bed, suddenly feeling something I hadn't felt in years. It was the same nervous fear I used to experience as a child lying awake in that room. For the first time since coming home, I felt less like an adult helping my family and more like a kid again. Normal life returning home to care for father. My father was recovering from a major surgery when I came home. The doctors expected him to improve, but the recovery process was slow and exhausting for everyone involved. My mother was doing most of the work herself and was clearly overwhelmed, even though she tried not to show it. I felt guilty for not visiting more often before everything happened, so staying there felt like the least I could do. My younger brother stopped by almost every day to help with groceries, appointments, and anything else that needed attention. The house was rarely quiet during the day, but it was a different kind of activity than I remembered growing up. Conversations were softer. Doors were closed more carefully. Everyone seemed conscious of letting my father rest. The house itself had changed surprisingly little. The paint in my bedroom was more faded than I remembered. The old dresser still had stickers attached to one side from when I was a teenager. Even the window lock looked exactly the same. Certain details felt frozen in time. The hallway still creaked in the same spot near the bathroom. The kitchen still smelled faintly of tea most mornings. Medicine bottles now sat on the counter beside things that had always been there. Because everyone was tired, strange things were easy to dismiss. If someone forgot to lock a door or misremembered where they left something, nobody questioned it very much. We were all focused on helping my father recover. Outside my bedroom window was a narrow walkway between our house and the neighbor's fence. It wasn't a place people normally used. Occasionally someone rolled trash bins through it. The meter reader came by every so often. Garden tools were stored near the back. Otherwise, it was mostly empty. That was one reason the shadow unsettled me so much. Standing in that walkway served no real purpose. There was nothing there to look at, nowhere to go, and no reason for anyone to be lingering outside my bedroom window in the middle of the night. Early warning signs, the window lock, and the side gate. A few days after seeing the shadow outside my window, I started noticing small things that felt connected, even though I couldn't explain why. The side gate was the first. Twice I found it unlatched when I was almost certain someone had secured it the night before. When I mentioned it, my mother barely reacted. She reminded me that the latch had been unreliable for years and said the wind probably shook it loose. Then I noticed the window lock in my bedroom. Growing up, that lock had always been stiff. I remembered needing both hands to force it open sometimes. Now it felt loose enough that I could move it with almost no effort. My mother blamed the age of the house. My brother laughed and said I was becoming paranoid from sleeping in my old haunted childhood room. At the time, I laughed too. One morning, while opening the curtains, I spotted a faint smear on the outside of the glass. It looked vaguely hand-shaped, though not clear enough to be certain. I convinced myself it was probably dirt or residue from rain. A few nights later, I woke to a soft brushing sound against the window screen. It lasted only a moment before stopping completely. By morning, I had almost talked myself out of believing I heard it. The most unsettling moment came from my father. He was sitting at the kitchen table, half asleep from medication, when he casually mentioned that someone had been walking outside earlier. Nobody paid much attention. My mother gently reminded him that he had been resting most of the afternoon. My brother changed the subject. Even I dismissed it, but looking back, that part stays with me. The one person who may have noticed something unusual was also the person everyone found easiest to doubt. Early warning signs, the window lock, and the side gate, a few days after seeing the shadow outside my window, I started noticing small things that felt connected, even though I couldn't explain why. The side gate was the first. Twice I found it unlatched when I was almost certain someone had secured it the night before. When I mentioned it, my mother barely reacted. She reminded me that the latch had been unreliable for years and said the wind probably shook it loose. Then I noticed the window lock in my bedroom. Growing up, that lock had always been stiff. I remembered needing both hands to force it open sometimes. Now it felt loose enough that I could move it with almost no effort. My mother blamed the age of the house. My brother laughed and said I was becoming paranoid from sleeping in my old haunted childhood room. At the time, I laughed too. One morning, while opening the curtains, I spotted a faint smear on the outside of the glass. It looked vaguely hand-shaped, though not clear enough to be certain. I convinced myself it was probably dirt or residue from rain. A few nights later, I woke to a soft brushing sound against the window screen. It lasted only a moment before stopping completely. By morning, I had almost talked myself out of believing I heard it. The most unsettling moment came from my father. He was sitting at the kitchen table, half asleep from medication. When he casually mentioned that someone had been walking outside earlier, nobody paid much attention. My mother gently reminded him that he had been resting most of the afternoon. My brother changed the subject. Even I dismissed it. But looking back, that part stays with me. The one person who may have noticed something unusual was also the person everyone found easiest to doubt. Peak event, someone whispering through the screen. The worst night happened a few days later. I was awake in bed, listening to my father coughing softly down the hallway. The house was otherwise quiet. Then I heard a familiar sound, the side gate, a slow metallic click. This time I didn't turn on the lamp. I stayed completely still and listened. A few seconds later, I saw the shadow appear against the curtain again. It was closer than before. I could tell because the outline looked larger, occupying more of the window than it ever had previously. Then I heard something else, a whisper. At first, it was too faint to understand. I thought it might be wind moving through the screen. But after a moment, I heard it again. It sounded like someone speaking my father's name. My entire body went cold. Trying not to make noise, I grabbed my phone and started recording audio. I slowly backed away from the window while keeping my eyes fixed on the curtain. The whisper came once more. Then everything happened at once. The screen outside shifted with a sharp sound. Immediately afterward, the loose window lock rattled. Not from inside the room, from outside. The noise snapped me out of whatever shock I was in. I screamed and stumbled backward. Within seconds, my mother was awake and shouting from the hallway. My brother, who had fallen asleep in the living room, came running toward the bedroom. We rushed outside through the front door and checked the side of the house. Nobody was there. The walkway was empty. But the evidence remained. The window screen had been bent inward near one corner, and the side gate stood completely open. For the first time, nobody in my family tried to explain it away. Someone had been outside that window. Someone had gotten close enough to touch it, and they had known my father's name. Aftermath and lingering impact. The name no one wanted to say. We reported everything, but the most disturbing part happened afterward. The next day, I listened to the audio recording on my phone several times. The whisper was faint, but it sounded like my father's name followed by something that resembled the words, "Let me in." When my mother heard it, she went noticeably pale. She admitted the voice reminded her of a former family acquaintance, someone who had once been close to my father and had recently asked about him through mutual contacts. Nothing was ever proven. My father eventually recovered, and I returned home. But I never felt comfortable sleeping in that room again. It taught me something strange. Childhood home can feel safe for decades, then lose that feeling in a single night. What moves outside the glass, looking back at all three stories, the thing that connects them isn't what was outside the window. It's the way each person reacted when they first noticed it. They explained it away. Most people would. Nobody wants to believe a shadow outside the glass is actually a person. Nobody wants to imagine that someone has learned their routine, found a way onto their building, or stood outside a childhood bedroom whispering a family member's name. Fear rarely arrives all at once. Usually it enters quietly, disguised as something ordinary. Maybe that's why these stories stay with me. At some point, you've probably noticed something outside a window and convinced yourself it was nothing. Most of the time, you're right. But sometimes the most disturbing part isn't seeing the shadow move. It's realizing that before it moved, it may have been standing perfectly still. It's watching for much longer than you ever noticed.